Sunday, August 25, 2013. This is Mercedes Diesel Guy, and this is my 1979 Mercedes 240D parts car. This won't be a complete step-by-step DIY, but I'm going to try to, as best I can, run you through the basics of removing the engine and transmission as a unit. I'm starting to part this car out now. It's worth noting that this is the first time I've actually removed an engine and transmission from a Mercedes, so that's one of the reasons it won't be a very in-depth DIY. Also, it's going to be so intricate, and there's going to be detailed differences between this and maybe other 240s and gas engine 123s and 300Ds, that not to mention the 300TD with a self-leveling suspension, that this is really just supposed to be a basic overview. But I'm going to get started now. I do have a shop crane to work with. I finally put it together yesterday, so the very first thing I did was I opened the hood and I raised it to the 90-degree position. This is great because it means I don't actually have to remove the hood from the car. So the very next thing I'm going to have to do is drain the engine oil, transmission, and the radiator. So I'm going to drain the fluids and then I'll continue on from there. Now that the engine oil, transmission, and radiator are drained, I'm actually going to remove the radiator. So I'm going to get the radiator out, which is mostly removing the two top clips up there and removing the clips for the fan shroud and disconnecting the hoses and getting it out. I don't think there's much more to it than that. Now that the radiator is out, the next thing I have to do is remove the air cleaner box. Next, I disconnected the throttle linkage, which was actually a little different here on the 79 than I'm used to. And although my instructions have not yet told me to, I don't think they will, so I'm actually going to disconnect the idle control cable from the throttle linkage, and then I'm going to suction out the fluid from the power steering hose reservoir. Next, I disconnected the power steering hoses from the power steering pump. My instructions after that tell me to remove the oil cooler, but from what I see, the oil cooler is actually just simply tied to the engine at this point. So what I'm going to do is actually just tie it up so it goes out with the engine, and if I run into trouble, then I will disconnect it later. The next step after that, as I understand, is to disconnect the AC compressor. Now, in my case, I'm lucky. The system has long since been discharged for years. So all I really have to do is just undo the hoses and whatever wires going to it. Next, I'm going to do something which I should have done before anything else. I'm going to disconnect and remove the battery. And then I'm going to disconnect any and all electrical connections from the body to the engine. After that's done, you disconnect the heater hoses that connect to the engine. The next step is to disconnect any and all vacuum lines to the engine. Tuesday, August 27, I'm actually going to do a little bit more disassembly work this evening. And the next two things I have to do are to disconnect the cables going to the alternator, and I have to get under the car again to do that. And I have to disconnect the oil pressure gauge line from the oil filter housing. So I'm going to go ahead and do those two things now. Now that that's done, the next thing I have to do is disconnect the exhaust system. Continuing with engine removal today, the next step is actually for me to get under the car again and release the exhaust pipe mount from near the transmission, and the grounding wire from the transmission to the body. And next, I have to disconnect the shift linkage from the transmission, also the speedometer sensor cable, and then working up top here, I'm actually going to disconnect the hydraulic line going to the clutch slave cylinder. And where I left off, I was working underneath the car, and the next step is actually for me to mark the relation of the front flex disc and drive shaft to the transmission output shaft. And once I mark that with some paint, I'm going to disconnect the center drive shaft bearing mount, and I'm going to disconnect the drive shaft from the transmission at the flex disc. So now my last step before removing the engine is to loosen the and remove the engine and transmission mount bolts from the bottom. And I'll be then, in theory, I should be able to hook up the crane and lift the engine out. Okay, in theory, everything should now be disconnected, and the engine should be able to be lifted right out. So, I've got the engine crane and load leveler hooked up, so, I don't know, wish me luck. Well, I have the engine out now. Kind of ran out of tape while I was actually lifting out the engine, but that kind of took precedence over filming it. So here's the engine with the transmission still attached. In the end, I had a lot of trouble moving the engine when I realized that I still needed to remove this through bolt here for the transmission mount, and at that point it was actually just easier to release the two bolts on the side of the transmission brace. So here it is in all its glory. As you can see, it's kind of dripping wet, mostly because I've been out here with with some scrub brushes and degreaser trying to clean it up a bit before I put it in the garage. And if I can't get it into the garage, I kind of have to leave it out here and cover it. So just trying to clean it up a bit. This is Mercedes Diesel Guy, and this is just your basic, mostly audio overview of removing a Mercedes 240D engine. And take this whole thing with a grain of salt. I mean, different years, different options are likely to make this different. I mean, I didn't have to deal with cruise control for one. Also, different models will make it different. It's going to be different for a 300D, I'm pretty sure of that. For example, my removal instructions referenced the engine shock absorber, releasing that, but I don't even think this engine has one, because I certainly did not disconnect anything. So, this is Mercedes Diesel Guy. Thanks for watching.